Hi, my name's Lee Jasper. This is Brixton, London, and you're watching Lee Jasper Drive Time.
Hi, good morning and welcome to live Lee Jasper Drive Time Home Edition. Can I thank you all for joining me this wonderfully gorgeous Saturday morning, at least it is here in London. And thank you very much for joining with us. This program today is a special. It is one of the first for the Lee Jasper Home Edition Drive Time. And we're going to focus on the COVID crisis. So could you, if you're in the watching now, if you could let everybody know we're live so we can gather a bit of an audience, that would be absolutely brilliant. And if you can join my pages, Lee Jasper on Facebook, that would be even better. First of all, can I say thanks to our sponsors, which is Black Sox and Section 109. Great to have their support to make sure this program can go out. And here's wishing you, all of you who are watching, I hope you're all well in these perilous and dangerous times. First of all, I couldn't do a program on COVID without offering my sincere condolences to the many, many people who've lost loved ones, friends and neighbours to this tragic illness. And I also couldn't do a program like this without paying tribute to the key workers on the transport, in the National Health Service, in social care and many other areas who continue to provide a service, continue to support the country and the community in providing quality care for those who are suffering in distress. Our hearts go out to you and we stand in real honour and tribute at the work that you do. Well, we're talking about the COVID crisis, and first of all, let's dispense with some conspiracy nonsense and theories. So on this program, there'll be no mention of the word 5G. We will not consider Bill Gates to be the Antichrist, and neither will we be discussing the fact that some people believe China deliberately planted the virus in the world, or it's part of an Illuminati world conspiracy to do us all in and hold the world to ransom and force us onto some international database. Nope, you're not going to get that here, because I think it's critically important for those who have a public voice that we refuse to go down the rabbit hole of ever-increasing conspiracy complexity. There are far too many people who should know better who are providing legitimacy and substance to misinformation and rumour. Of course, naturally, in such a crisis, they will inevitably produce a feverish comment and speculation. That's just the nature of crisis. But at such times, it's really important that we are led by objective facts, the science, and the science is irrefutable. This is a virus that is spread by human-to-human contact. So now, having dismissed all of that cock and bull theory and story, let's focus on the program. Having a devastating effect on Black and Asian and ethnic minority communities, and particularly those within the lower socio-economic groups. We've all seen over the last few weeks the constant headlines and heard the commentary on the news about that disproportionate impact. And it's indisputable that our community is suffering greatly as a consequence of this virus. But it should be no surprise to anybody that the virus attacks the poorest in our community, and the social economic realities brought about by structural racism, yes, I'm saying that word, structural institutional racism, provide at least part of the explanation, alongside the inevitable underlying health inequalities and conditions that are part and parcel of any community experience of being immersed in poverty. This is all a reflection of structural the racism they face and the reality of growing health inequalities. The fact is that the gap between Black and white life expectancy and quality of life has been growing, particularly for the African, Caribbean, Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, at an alarming rate over the last 2 decades. The recent Marmot review on health inequalities for the NHS, a review that looked at what these health inequalities are, confirmed the alarming growth and disparities regarding health rates, inequality rates in our communities. And just to get on to the factual bit, because we need to keep to the facts, the Office of National Statistics has found that taking into account age and other social demographic characteristics and measures of self-reported health and disability in the 2011 census, so don't forget that that's some time ago now, we're due another census quite quickly, but the risk of COVID-related deaths for males and females for Black ethnicity is 1.9 times more likely than those than white. So we are twice as likely to die as a consequence of contracting this disease. Of course, more broadly, there was an analysis published by the Financial Times that found that poor socioeconomic conditions and public-facing occupations expose BME people to a greater risk. Black men and women were respectively 4.2 and 4.3 times more likely to die of coronavirus than their white peers in England. That's just taking it as a whole. Don't forget, when you adjust for socioeconomic conditions, it goes down to 1.9. So you need to be clear about the statistics. And the risk of death for Britons from Bangladeshi and Pakistani origin is more than 3 times higher, while those from the Chinese and mixed ethnicities are around twice as likely to die from this virus. And taking into account the age and other social demographics, it's important that we get that context right. We've all seen the impacts on the brave and committed National Health Service workers, those who work in the social care sector, the key workers in such areas such as transport. They would just continue to pay an heavy price for their public service. But let's not be fooled. Many of these workers have no option but to continue to work if they are not being furloughed by their employers. They simply can't afford not to. Quoted in the Daily Mail, Dame Donna Kinnair, she's the chief executive of the Royal College of Nursing, said Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff should be asked to be moved from the front line if they feel endangered. And we all know that the lack of protection equipment has been a key issue in the infection rate during this virus crisis. She described the figures as difficult and distressing, adding, they show that our fears that disproportionate numbers of nursing staff, as well as patients from Black Asian communities, are dying from the virus. And their fears are well founded. And she goes on to say, we are calling for all BME healthcare staff who feel that they may be at high risk, whether because of diabetes, heart disease, or simply because they don't have adequate personal protection equipment, to ask their managers for urgent risk assessments and, if necessary, to deploy away from the front line. Health issues are bad enough being exposed by this crisis, but the virus has also revealed that there is a social crisis, a political crisis, revealing our true position here in the United Kingdom. I don't know if you remember at the end of last year when the government announced plans for a new immigration system. If you remember, they said they would have excluded anyone from entering the country, thousands of people who they are now claiming are the life and savior of the nation. Social carers, teachers and healthcare assistants, cleaners and childcare workers, once deemed low skills, are now deemed to providing life-saving care. And this points to the hypocrisy of the situation we now face and that this virus has exposed. These workers, most of whom were women, were deemed low-skilled and now have been redesignated as critical by the government in fighting the outbreak. It's absurd that current immigration legislation and criteria would actually disqualify many of the people putting their lives in danger to deliver vital care in the wake of this coronavirus. For example, 24% of carers are on 0-hour contracts, so it's nearly impossible to predict their annual salaries. For those working on set hours, average starting salaries fall between 16,000 and 19.5 grand a year. And the key cleaners keeping our hospitals sanitized clean as possible, they're unlikely to earn more than 20 grand. And yet, if you don't earn £18,600 in this country, you can have your visa revoked and you can be deported. Unbelievably, the policy of the hostile environment continues. Deportations are continuing. The Guardian newspaper reported this week that a private jet understood to be hired from Titan Airways, they're the deportation airways of choice. They've got an office in Victoria, took off from Stansted deporting Eastern Europeans on Thursday, the 30th of April. It's absolutely amazing that people who got fruit rotting in the field were importing, on the one hand, workers to come from Romania to pluck that fruit, and on the other hand, the government still deporting people in the way that I've just described. And these immigration rules affect us all. The Guardian last week reported that over 100,000 NHS staff in England, and about half the women working as full-time carers and 25% of the teaching force, are putting their lives at risk during the crisis, despite not earning enough to have the right to a family life in the UK. Absolutely absurd. And the same immigration rules on income requirements also means that key workers feel forced to work in dangerous conditions. Why? Because if they lose their jobs and their income falls, they'll be deported and their families broken apart. The Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants produced a report, Families on the Front Line. And it said it received over 7,000 inquiries from families who are desperately worried how they're going to stay together during the crisis. We're also going to go on to talk about mental health issues because they're very important and even more reinforcing the need to stop the misinformation and conspiracy theories who are providing anxiety and ill health and mental stress to vulnerable people in our community. Asylum seekers are homeless and without access to public funds. They're homeless on the street. They can't access health services. What the hell is this government doing in creating the circumstances where people who could be potentially catching and suffering from the virus are left unaided in this way? And it just shows that they're prepared to maintain an ideological commitment to these draconian immigration policies, even at the public health expense. We know that the public health review has been announced by government. Trevor Phillips, our dear brother, is destined to lead that. And we're going to focus on that, although I want to talk less about the man because, frankly, he's irrelevant. And I want to talk more about the fact that Public Health England, on the most important issue that affects Black communities in a generation, thinks it can just do what it likes in appointing anybody it chooses to a public health, whether it's Trevor Phillips or anybody else. That cannot be right. And all of that review should have been worked out in partnership with Black and ethnic minority organizations. And just finally, on the international stage, it's impossible to talk about this without focus on that wider world. And to resolve this crisis without international and global cooperation and organizations like the World Health Organization and the United Nations and many others, that will be key in the fight to combat this virus across the planet. No nation, no individual nation, France, Germany, the United States, has the luxury of seeking to hermetically seal its borders in the hope that it can save its own people from this virus. It's brutally clear now that despite the pretensions of nationalism, all humanity is linked across the planet in an immutable, desperate fight against this virus. We will all quite simply sink or swim together. And of late, we've seen glimmers of hope in relation to international action and cooperation. Yesterday, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen co-hosted a landmark coronavirus global response summit along the United Kingdom, and other international partners that successfully raised 6.5 billion in initial funding to kickstart global cooperation around COVID. The summit call was a call to action from the World Health Organization and other global actors to launch the new Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator Initiative that aims to bring everybody together. In America, we've seen disproportionality. 13.54% of all Americans are African American, and yet they're made up 60% of deaths, according to a study published by CNN. And in Africa, we see that confirmed cases of COVID-19, although remaining comparatively low at 51,000 as of the 6th of May, but those numbers are growing fast. And a new report by the Partnership for the Evidence-Based Response to COVID-19 reveals some worrying findings about the impact of coronavirus on the lives of many Africans. Although there's a relatively young population in Africa, and that may be to Africa's advantage, current data suggests that those infected in the sub-Saharan Africa are only 3% of the population are 65 years or older, and 43% are less than 15 years old. Big contrast to the European Union, where our elderly population is legion. And so there are huge international repercussions here, huge domestic repercussions. And that's my summary. We're going to go straight to our guests. And my guest today, I'm delighted to be joined and say a big hello to Faye Bruce. She's chair of CARN, the Caribbean Health Network here in Manchester. She's a Northwest Lead Maternity Transformation Program Director and a nursing doctoral researcher and a community board representative for Manchester Cathedral, a great cathedral. If you've never been to Manchester, that's definitely on the sightseeing list. I'm also joined by Preeti Rana, mental health professional. She's a senior manager at a foremost leading health charity. She also hosts Real Talk UK on YouTube and is a consultant running her own private consultancy, Remind. Also with us today are Viv R, entrepreneur, futurologist, Black Sox sponsor and director of the dynamic Aspire Prep Education Group along with Patricia Lamore there, and David Weaver, who is the chair of CORE, that's a coalition of race equality organisations, and the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. I bid you all good morning in this wonderful morning for my summary of the international and domestic crisis. And I wondered if I could start with Viv Amoon. And just to say, before I start, Faye has to leave us by 11 o'clock. So I'm going to take her second. And hopefully we'll get some joint discussion in before she leaves. So over to Viv Amoon. Desperate times, people are in pain, critical challenges, not just for Britain, but the entire world. What's your take? You need to unmute your mic.
I thought it was being handled for me. So, yeah, very slow start for me. I think the model that I've adopted over the last few decades has been slow, quick, slow in the middle of crisis, because often it's unclear what moves need to be made other than the immediate ones in an effort to save lives and protect the vulnerable. But what's beginning to become clear is much of what you said about the way this virus is singling out different sections of our wider society, and also how the resources that have been made available are being allocated. And I think that's a really important bit that we're definitely beginning to focus on, that ongoing disparity and inequality between the most privileged and the most disadvantaged. I think there isn't enough information going on at a community level. As you've rightly said, too much of the information has been driven by the conspiracy theories. And I think that not enough has been done to dispel those at a community level. So in terms of how things play out, how things are going forwards, I want to talk about the reality on the ground for individuals in our community. The starting point is this ongoing sense of uncertainty about what's happening today, which is why these conspiracy theories are getting so much traction, and what's likely to happen tomorrow. Tomorrow being next month, are the lockdowns going to be eased? Even the word lockdown doesn't make a lot of sense, because in reality, for the most part, we are not locked down. There is a restriction both on the information that we have access to regarding what's happening in this country, even in the next borough, and what's happening abroad. So there's a lockdown there in terms of restricted information. There's a lockdown in terms of one's ability to go out and generate income. There's a lockdown there, but there isn't a lockdown in terms of access to Netflix and the kind of stuff that's going to distract you and allow you to not focus on reality. There isn't really a lockdown on our young people. They're told that they can go out. They're being told that the virus doesn't target them if they're under 30, and yet at the same time they're being told that it's not safe for them to be out and they've got to stay in. So the information for our young people is not clear. Generally, young people across the country and globally, the information is not clear. It's contradictory. And then particularly for our young black people, young black men, the information is not clear and as a consequence, dangerous, because they've got the conspiracy theory type information coming in one ear, and then they've got this inconsistent state information coming in the other ear. It's coming from a source they don't trust anyway, and it's unclear. So I think that's generating a level of toxicity that we're going to have to deal with, and we are increasingly dealing with, because there are incidents taking place out there between the police and our young people as the police begin to enjoy and exercise these unlimited freedoms that they now have, by contrast to abuse and target sections in our community in even greater numbers than was the case before COVID-19. I think that there's a real issue regarding all of that pent-up energy and how it is being displaced within the home. Not enough emphasis for us as a community on our vulnerable children and our vulnerable women, and indeed our vulnerable men in this pressure cooker of an environment that's been further polluted by this ongoing sense of uncertainty and contradictions that we've been fed every day. I think there are real issues regarding how we're being represented as a community at a strategic level. I mean, you made reference to Trevor Phillips, Lee, and I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think there are too many individuals in our community speaking on our behalf with no accountability. And maybe that's the order of things. But there's no reason why they couldn't be transparency. So the conversations that they're having in Westminster through Zoom and all these other platforms, information about much needed resources has been made available that our communities can access, and information about how resources will be made available in the next year, 2 years, 5 years or so. There's no reason why they couldn't be making that information more readily available within our wider community at such a desperate and important time. I think that's got to change. It's one of the things Black Sox definitely wants to get a grip of as we begin to move into the second phase post over lockdown. Who actually is speaking on behalf of the African and Caribbean community in the UK? I'm not as concerned about the BAME agenda. I think that's a very broad, amorphous category. And in these times of extreme crisis, I think it's critically important that we begin to focus down and become very specific about what we're saying and whom we're saying it to. So I'm not accustomed to being on camera. It's one of those things that I put down at least a decade ago. But I do think in these extreme times, every one of us is going to determine what our purpose will be in terms of being in service to our community. And mine, I feel, is going to be to ensure that the right information gets to our people at the right time so that they can act on it. And by that, I mean the African and Caribbean community in the UK and globally. We want to work in partnership with our brothers and sisters in Australia and Canada and in South America, Brazil, and in Europe, and not least on the African continent and the Caribbean, to develop a broader global picture of what's actually happening for us, because it's varied. The story in Africa, on the African continent, isn't the same as the story in South America, where literally thousands of us are dying. It's not the same story as the story in North America, where thousands and thousands of Black people are dying. And it's definitely not the same story as the story in the UK. So we need strong communities, communities that connect up, collaborate and share with other strong communities. So we're going to have to do that going forwards in order to get through the first phase of this crisis. And I think it's important that we're in no doubt that this is the beginning of a crisis that's going to run on top of the crises that we've had to be dealing with as a community, both in the UK and globally. But this is a beginning of a new phase that's going to impact us for at least a generation. We need to be ethical about how we conduct ourselves. Those of us who have access to resources are able to position ourselves in the midst of this crisis, are better able to see over the parapets and identify what's coming downstream. It's going to be much more important, I believe, that those of us who are in that position operate in a transparent, ethical, and service leadership orientated way. So that's my broad overview. I think there's much more that we're going to need to do going forward to speak to individuals in our community and bring the flesh, the bone, and the blood and the heart of this issue back into the narrative. We're not going to get it from BBC or ITV. Their concern is to ensure that the horses, so to speak, are not startled. So they'll want to dehumanize everything and keep it down to statistics. To suggest that the fact that only 600 people have died today is a result, however eloquently they put it, is horrifying in of itself. We're looking at more than 31,000 people dead so far, and this is only the first phase of the virus. There is going to be at least potentially a second phase, and potentially even a third phase. We're losing our elders as a community at horrifying numbers, and we need to address that by taking up a leadership position. So I'm going to stop there. I think it's important that I hear as well from our other esteemed colleagues on the Lee Jasper drive time. I might even nibble at my breakfast whilst everybody else is talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Viv R, and raised some important issues: domestic violence, mental health and vulnerabilities in our communities, ethical leadership, all this emergency COVID money. Where's it going? Who's talking to government on our behalf? How's it get distributed? Is it going to the right people? All key questions that I think need answering. And of course, the issue of representation and accountability. Oh, fine, you're talking at 10 Downing Street with senior government officials and departments, but who's feeding back to the wider community so that everybody can understand what's being said in our name and determined on our behalf? And the intergenerational impact, spoke about, this lasting for some time. I'm going to go on, if I may, to David Weaver, and unless Faye's ready, which I'm thinking she's not, having some technical difficulties. I think then what I'll do is I'll scrub David Weaver and I will go to Pretty Rana. And let's hear from Pretty. Pretty, if Faye joins us, given she goes at 11, I will bring her back in if you don't mind. Slightly distracted, but yeah, what's your take on some of the stuff you've heard and your reflections on these issues?
For me, even being in the field and leading a team on the front line, especially around mental health work, real concern for me is the clear messaging that's been out there. There isn't any. It's been confusing for many members, but also there is an issue around making sure literature or any of these messages are available for different community groups to understand what's happening with COVID, and what services or what support is available has been difficult for many communities to understand. In my position as well, I see it being really difficult in trying to make sure that there's enough representation whilst making decisions with public health or with the NHS, and making sure that there's enough of us around the table, not just talking about our needs and issues, but also allowing us to have some input in building a better services for our communities. We're also seeing in general that the frontline staff are experiencing issues regarding their wellbeing and anxiety. So there are phone lines that have been set up, but we don't know the proportions of BME community members that are on the front line that are suffering with mental health issues at the moment. There's a lot of fear. I'm also concerned around the narrative in regards to BME staff working on the front line and being removed or redeployed. For me, I think we'd need clarity around what does that mean for us? Does that mean that we get removed from service and get pushed further away from the specialisms that we have? And also another concern for me is young people. If they were already experiencing issues around employment previously, which was already creating high anxiety and stress for them, what is going to happen now going forward into the future due to COVID concerns and all the kind of economical issues that we have? And a final concern for me, Lee, is around the Mental Health Act and how that's changed at the moment and how that's going to move forward. We've already got a disparity in regards to most of the kind of Black community being overrepresented in mental health systems and Asians not being represented at all. So those are issues that really are a concern for me.
Thank you, Pretty. I think you raised some really important issues, not least the impact on the welfare and health of our frontline staff, who are not only coping with all that they have to in their day-to-day jobs, but also trying to deal with protecting their families, dealing with hostile immigration, young people who may be out and subject to focus from police attention, and all that brings with it. And you spoke about lots of fear. You can imagine fear is rampant in our communities, particularly amongst those who are working at that front line. And the impact upon unemployment. You know, if we had high unemployment to begin with, you know, how high is that going to be after the economic consequences of this crisis follow through, which I think will have profound social implications for our communities. We thought things were bad in terms of mental health and youth behavior prior, then one only can speculate on what will be after. And you're right about the Mental Health Act, to the extent that people can now be sectioned at the drop of a hat, it seems to me. One professional, I think it was 3 professionals, different professionals prior, and now one person can simply say you're sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And we've seen examples of that on the street being used against our community. So you've made some powerful and coherent points, and we thank you for your continued service on that front line. And it's good to have a frontline provider on this discussion with Drive Time today. I'm not sure what's happening with our good sister Faye, so I'm forced to go on and bring in the president of the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapists, David Weaver. He's also a chair of CORE, the Coalition for Race Equality, and he will speak about these mental health issues. You may pick up on other issues such as the public health inquiry by the Public Health England, and indeed the conversations with government about emergency resources being made available to communities in this crisis. So Dave, welcome to Lee Jasper Drive Time. What's your reflections on what you've heard so far?
First of all, thank you, Lee, and thank you for putting on this this show. It's a really very important medium for people to have real conversations about real things that are going on in our communities. I mean, the first thing I would say is that, I mean, let's contextualize this thing. People are dying around us. It's funny when I have conversations with white colleagues that I work with, yes, they're being impacted, but the stories that they tell and the distance that they have from the death and the illness and the impacts that we experience when we speak to our families and our friends, it's really very stark, and it is really very, very serious, this thing. And the disproportionality, as you've explained already within your introduction, the other speakers have said so. But, you know, whatever the conspiracies are that are going around, you know, we've got to put that to one side. We're in a real and present danger. And we have to, you know, it stands for us to take proper action to address this, given those disproportionalities. And you've spoken about some of the figures, up to 4 more times likely to die and so forth. And I won't go into all of that. But we do know that the most vulnerable to COVID have been the elderly, those in the care homes, those in high density impoverished housing, underlying illnesses such as type 2 diabetes, coronary problems, and especially from those where deprivation has been linked to the long history of unequal health outcomes. You know, we make up just 14% of the population, yet 44% of the NHS. You know, I go out like I did last night and clap from those NHS workers. But you know, when I clap, I wonder how many people who are clapping in this country are really thinking about the people that are taking the hit, and the people that are taking the hit are our nurses. You speak to the nursing profession. There's already some concern about the management practices that were existent before COVID. Many BME staff, Black and minority staff, feel that often they're put into situations where they shouldn't be put in. They may be bank nurses, and these are the ones being put in the front line without the right kinds of equipment. And not to mention the other key workers, such as delivery drivers, bus drivers, workers on 0-hour contracts, the carers. We're talking about the older people are dying in care homes, and they're Black nurses that are disproportionately dying in relation to that. So now, just to set the context, it's a really serious piece. And my concern now is that the popular press, the mainstream press, and there is a narrative building which is blaming us. So I think it was the Times last week or the Telegraph that actually had a headline which said that people like us, people that are raising these issues around what needs to be done, are playing in victimhood, and that narrative is developing. So they're blaming the victim, and as my friend, and we all know him, Lord Simon Woolley, said on your show last night, Viv, is that we're not going to be blamed for dying in greater numbers from COVID-19. We're not going to be blamed for being poor, but we've got to be really alert to what the issues are. Viv spoke earlier about the importance of leadership and proper leadership and ethical leadership and unity. I'll come back to that in a while, but that is so important. But we've asked for reviews, and we've asked for a public inquiry, which is still being asked for now. We asked for a review into the circumstances, and we got a review from Public Health England. And most of you who are listening to this will know there's been massive concern about the prominent involvement of Trevor Phillips. But I'm not going to make a big piece about Trevor Phillips, only suffice to say this, that where there's so much concern about a particular individual who has made statements that are Islamophobic, who has employed data that has been of concern in terms of how it has been used in the Metropolitan Police and elsewhere, and concern around how that kind of data can stereotype and then potentially lead to a situation where we're looking at biological or genetic determinants as a reason for this disproportionality. Actually, that is very dangerous. And whether people are right or wrong, and this is the point, whether people are right or wrong, any inquiry into anything, does not command the support of the public or those people who are on the receiving end of it, is flawed. When any individual becomes the news then it's flawed. You don't have confidence in the outcomes. And so it's not about the person. It's not about the person, but it's about the confidence that the Black communities could have around this. And we're concerned because I'm the independent chair of the Coalition for Race Equality Organisations, and we've written to Public Health England. And I have to say that we're not happy with the response that didn't address at all the specifics of what we were saying about confidence from BME communities. And even if the reasons that they give are right, give them the benefit of the doubt. If you have a continuing concern about the perception that the outcomes could be predetermined because of the people who are involved in it, then there's a problem. There's a problem. And we always say in politics, if you become the news, then that's a problem. And I'm afraid Trevor Phillips has become the news in that. But just to move on from that, I think that there are a couple of things I would want to say, and other people want to get in here. The mental health impacts are absolutely critical. And in my role as president of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, what I am pushing very, very hard is for that organisation, amongst other organisations dealing with mental health, is to recognise that when we see these figures on our screen around the disproportionality of Black people dying, what needs to go side and side with that is the impact, the psychological impact that is having on our communities. If you're seeing your family and your friends dropping like flies, it's going to have an impact. And I tell you this, in 6 months, a year, 2-3 years down the line, we're dealing with trauma, very serious trauma. So the mental health impact of this is absolutely key. I was in a Zoom call. I presented to a significant number of Black church leaders early this week. It was last week, I'm losing sense of time. And that issue came out, that the leaders that our communities are going to are often in those Black churches, and they're impacted themselves. They're having conversations about how do we deal with this as leaders. I won't go into all the detail around this, and Pretty's mentioned some of those mental health impacts, but that is a big deal. What about the Windrush generation? So, you know, the Windrush generation, it's almost a double impact here. So first of all, they're traumatized by the Windrush generation. And then this COVID-19 situation hits. They're traumatized because they've been forgotten. And now they've been traumatized by the very impact of COVID-19 itself. So we've got a responsibility here, and it's a leadership responsibility. I'll end and summarize with this. We've got a responsibility, almost a personal responsibility to that generation, and it is time limited. It's a matter of self-respect for all of us individually and as a community. And we also have a leadership responsibility because of the traumatic impacts of this, which will go intergenerational going forward to those communities going forward. The other leadership piece, and this is the last, it really is the last piece, and Lee mentioned this, and my role as independent chair within CORE is taking me quite center stage to this. It's the very issue around funding, because the way the government is constructing this is in two phases, the emergency phase and the recovery phase. Well, for Black folks, we've always been in an emergency situation, and this is a writ large emergency situation. And funding is being put forward for this emergency phase. And Black organizations who are, and community organizations who are in the front line of this are not getting the monies. But what we have is a desperate need for proper, united, coherent leadership. Because as the funders mess around and saying, well, we're not sure who to fund, or we need to be aware of what some of the issues are, our people begin to die. So what that requires then is a real focused, unified leadership point, leadership of the type that Viv mentioned when he gave his particular piece. And then that lends itself to my closing summary, which is that the only thing that power respects is power. And what power respects is the unified leadership from people that are speaking truth to power. So we have a responsibility to make sure that we do that. And leadership and unified leadership doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything, but what it does mean is that we have to understand that we've got to be unified going forward, and we need to work with our communities to do that. So I hope that helps with the conversation.
Thank you, Dave. Well, some fabulous contributions there from the minutiae to the global. Unfortunately, Faye has not been able to resolve her technical difficulties, which is a real shame, because I was very keen to hear from Manchester and the Caribbean Health Network down there. But no fear, we will have her back on in a future program so that we can hear some of the work that she's doing. And look, this coronavirus issue is going to play on and on. So we've no doubt have plenty of opportunities to be able to revisit the discussion. We've got some questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to put them to you. One is around where somebody can find Black therapists. So I'd like to hear some response on that. The other one was a question as, are there Black scientists looking into this issue anywhere in the world? I'm not sure what Black scientists would come to in terms of conclusions other than what we already know, but there are thousands of Black epidemiologists and scientists across the African continent who are working extraordinarily hard to look at this issue. So yes, to the answer to that question. And conspiracy, where can people get quality information if they want to avoid the conspiracy? I'd offer a response to that, only because I've taken time to try and find some information, and that's the World Health Organization. We didn't talk about it here, but the issue about whether this vaccine that everybody's working on will be available to all poor communities, African, Caribbean, and Asian throughout the world simultaneously at no cost, is a real issue, and the United Nations and the World Health Organizations are doing that. And you can find lots of information practically about what leading scientists at that global level coming together are saying and finding out about COVID. Any response to the issues around Black therapies, about quality information, Viv?
Thanks, Lee. I'm going to avoid the points that David made about Trevor Phillips and the inquiry, because I don't really think anything of any real significance is going to come out of that inquiry anyway. The time that I spend here, I'm really going to want to focus on the community and some practical responses for people. So in terms of therapists, I want to make reference to one organization. It's a Black-led practice called Janus Solutions. You can Google that and come up, but you can also contact us on info@blacksocks.com. I know MediaNet will provide that information later on. And we will provide you with the contact details for Janus Solutions and other Black therapists and support staff that can give our young people and our families the support that they need. I mean, that's a really important jumping off point, actually, that there isn't any specific place at the moment that you can go to get information about empathic provision for you as an African and Caribbean individual or family or professional who needs support. That's one of the things we want to address, and think Lee's kind of going to have us on again next week, Saturday, so the beginning of Mental Health Week, so that we can talk about OMAR, the Open Minds Alliance, which is a new network that's being launched. It will be launched next weekend. And OMAR will speak on behalf of Black communities at that more strategic level to make sure that the resources that have been allocated around mental health go to Black professionals and Black organizations, Black-led organizations that actually know what our communities require. And for the most part, what they don't need is to be incarcerated or medicated. What they need is really healthy, centric talking therapy, and for the whole community to be actively involved in the prevention and early intervention related support to meet their needs, particularly our young people. And we know that our young Black men are disproportionately represented in all of these dysfunctional systems, not just the mental health one. NAFCIAT Amazing service. It's been running for so many years, back to when I was actually practicing as a psychotherapist and delivering services all over the country. At the moment, NAFCIAT delivers services across Camden, Islington, and I think Haringey, but because of its credibility and its depth and breadth of expertise, many draw on it for further information and connections. And again, we can get that information to you. I know that David's probably going to want to talk about the BACP's membership of Black professionals. It's not as many as we would like, but with David Weaver as the Black president, he's definitely made an impact on the BACP as an organization's understanding of its obligations to meet the needs of all sections of the community. One of the things I think we need to really get a grip of in the midst of this crisis is how we address the shortfall so we don't find ourselves here again. And that for me is about mobilizing and capacity building our needs going forwards. Omar will be focusing on providing the training, the tools, the expertise necessary for us to meet our own needs, provide our own talk therapy related interventions. There have been some pilots that have been run recently, the last couple of years or so, in the UK and abroad, where they've trained up barbers to provide early intervention type talking therapy. It's worked extremely well, but because we've relied on government resources to develop those things, short-term funding with a short-term vision, those very dynamic and powerfully impactive services have withered on the vine. We're going to want to revitalize those kinds of initiatives and ensure that they're sustainable by providing the resources, not primarily from government. We'll use our tax money to add to those services, but we won't rely on government money exclusively to keep them running. It's a mistake that we've made over and over again within the community. So I think the main point is, for those who are listening, if you contact Black Socks on info@blacksox.com, and that's BLAKSOX.com, info@blacksox.com, get on the mailing list. We'll provide you with the contacts and connects that you need. Black Socks as an organization is networked not just across the UK, but globally. And we will also, which I think is a really important point, that going back to what David said as my last point on this, provide you with information about the resources, the money that's been made available from government, and where appropriate, will also support you in completing those applications. And that last bit is aimed at organizations that are doing great work in the community. They understand, where the needs are, and potentially where additionality could be brought to those needs. We'd be more than willing to provide guidance and help in completing those forms to make sure that much needed service gets to our communities. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Viv. And more information coming in from the viewers out there. There's the Pan-African Health Organization, as well as the World Health Organization. And that's the body on the continent that'll be working on these things. The issue of therapy has been raised again and again, and the need to get culturally appropriate therapy, not necessarily mainstream therapy, if I can use that words. Incredibly important.
Absolutely. I think it's important that you have the ability to feel that you can relate to the person that you're talking to, especially when you go in for therapy. I think Viv has covered most of the organisations that I know that deliver therapy. Because I work within predominantly North London, NAFCIAT is one of our really good services for therapy, and that allow individuals to have different cultural experiences there. But yeah, sorry, Lee. Viv did cover a lot of the main points for me.
Well, I'll add one he didn't cover. That's Black Thrive, that's out there, and they do quite a lot of work, particularly over in South London. We want to give them a shout out. Very much was instrumental, I think, in driving the barbershop efforts very early on, at least in South London, to my recollection. But thank you for that, Faye. David, I think
Yeah,
we've sent you a challenge insofar as responding to some of these issues. You've got a Black therapist network, nascent, developing, growing though that may be, in the BACP. Do tell us more.
yeah, it's not big enough, but there are groupings of Black therapists up and down the country that coalesce around BACP. So I don't go into too much detail on that. david.weaver@bacp.co.uk, and then I can give a lot more information around that. But in fact, there is a Black therapist grouping now, which has been organised by someone called Helen James within BACP, which is bringing together not just counsellors or psychotherapists, but also psychologists as well. So I can give, if you take my details and contact me, I can give you information around that. But it does lend itself to a wider. Well, before I say the other point is that there are also counsellors that are part of church organisations. So in the meeting that I had earlier this week, I was giving information around a number of churches up and down the country that do have qualified counsellors within that. And there are community organisations that then call themselves counsellors that can provide support as well in that regard. But the other point I was going to make is that we desperately need to get more Black people into the profession. And this is the push that we have been making for a long time now, and changing the criteria, because the criteria for entry into the profession rules out the very people that are needed in this society to ensure that they get that Black people get proper, culturally appropriate and authentic therapeutic inputs from people that look like them. So it's really important, and we all will know people in our communities, be they barbers, hairdressers, or the uncle or auntie on their estate or whatever in our communities that have those natural skills. We've got to get into the profession. So one of the things I've been doing is just speaking to lots of people in the BACP and ensuring that BACP take it as a mainstream issue, and that we are looking at ways of how we can subsidise people in our communities to get into the profession to do so. But in the immediate time where there's a real and ever-present danger, I think what we could do, Lee, Viv and Pretty, is to try and compile one list which we could send out and link you into some of those other networks that are doing this as well.
Thanks. I think we are joined by Faye. I know she hasn't got a lot of time. Am I right in looking at the screens? I can't see her. Yes. Hello, Faye. Well, welcome back.
Hi, sorry about that. And it can go at any time. So I do apologise for the missing information. I'm sure is being circulated on this programme this morning. So I'm here. So I'll be here for another 2 minutes or so.
All right. Well, why don't I just bring you in, because I know you're due to get off to do other things, and just wanted your overall reflections on the issues. Over to you, Faye.
Yeah. So as you may or may not know, that the Caribbean and African Health Network in Greater Manchester started about 3 years ago now, and we started with the agenda to address the health disparities in the Caribbean and African community. So we make no apology for the fact that we wanted to target specifically on Black people, because we saw the inherent disadvantage that we were having across all of the different sectors, and of course health being the foundation of our action. So we can't do very much without our health. So we wanted to focus on the health inequalities. And as we've been going through the last few years, and of course you may know that I'm doing my doctorate, which is about to be submitted, is we highlight the grave inequalities that are prevalent in our community, and we see those things actually getting worse. So what we wanted to do was just to make sure that within Greater Manchester there was a voice, because again, as you know, the voice of the Black people are often not heard on decision-making tables, and it was really important that we got around the table around devolution in Greater Manchester. We're so grateful to have that, where we are very, very much sitting around the table talking to senior decision makers, but with the backing of the community at large in Greater Manchester. And what we are seeing are fruits coming from that. So, for example, when we looked at the maternal mortality statistics around Black women being more likely to, well, 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy or as a result of their pregnancies, and their children, their babies, are 122% more likely to die in the first month. So we've seen comparable statistics to what we hear and know about in America. And what we did is that we contacted the Greater Manchester Partnership, and we said, look, you know, this is what is out there. We've known about the kind of variations and the disadvantage for Black women, thinking intersectionally as well. So, you know, here's the national statistics. What is going on at the GM level? Only to find out, you know, a few months later on that it did reflect the national picture. So we said, right, okay, this, as part of devolution, we need to be doing something about this. And of course, straight away, we got the backing of the partnership and others, and we had Jacqueline Dunkley-Bent and people come to conference. And now there's a roundtable discussion that is involving lots of Black people, looking at how do we correct this disparity. So when we look at COVID-19, we see huge similarities, you know, where we see the ONS data, and there is a lot of, like, you know, people mistrusting the data, saying it's not true. You know, how could we be 4 times more likely to die, you know, as a result of COVID, or 1.9 times more likely to die if we take into account all the different, you know, age, etc., etc. You know, how is that possible? And the way that we're looking at it in Greater Manchester, and certainly the survey that we've done so far, where we've got over 300 people from just in GM completing a survey, which is asking about the impact that COVID-19 is having on them and on their organisation. We can see those structural inequalities, the structural decisions that are made. We can see those coming to bear. We can see how people are really struggling for the most basic needs. You know, the thing that's coming out particularly you know, heavily is around mental health, as you can imagine. So that the mental well-being of people, it's even almost that we find that people are very, very concerned about what is going to happen when we come out of this lockdown, or whatever we want to call it. What's going to happen to them? Because many people, again, have lost their jobs, or they've been furloughed, and they don't know whether their companies are actually going to survive this at all. But we almost see a situation where we have many of our people saying, I'm actually quite comfortable where I am. I'm quite happy being at home, because at home it's a safe space for me. And, you know, coming out of the lockdown into the kind of unknown is the thing that is most daunting. So it's about how we as a community are looking at how do we prepare ourselves for a number of these challenges that we're going to see, or that we are seeing now, and we know we're going to see as time goes on. And the collective community spirit that we've managed to galvanise in Manchester is brilliant. I think had we not had an infrastructure such as Khan, then we would probably see a lot more fragmentation going on across Greater Manchester. But we do have a forum where we all come together every 2 weeks, and we're talking about community leaders, community influencers. You know, we're talking about people that have just got a genuine passion, you know, to actually play their part. And I hear you, David, when you talked about, you know, the psychotherapists and some of the gaps in our services. You know, it's about people saying, you know, I've got these skills, I've got those skills, I want to put those into the mixing pot, and I want to offer my services to enable our community to actually try and come out of this with some, you know, something positive. So we've got a lot going on in Manchester. The next meeting we've got is with Andy Burnham, our mayor across for Greater Manchester. Because Khan has good relationships with some of these people. And I know we talk about system failures and structural disadvantage. However, you know, it's really important for us to have those dialogues with our leaders, those decision makers. We were having a conversation just the other day with the chief exec for one of the hospitals in Manchester, who's talked about resetting the dial. you know, it's about, you know, how do we move forward from that, and how do we connect in a more trusting way with our community, with our Black communities in particular. So there's a lot going on. I think we've got a real opportunity to, as I say, reset that dial and look at how we can move forward in light of COVID, because these health inequalities, we know they've been here for a long, long time. You know, I put it down to, you know, it is epigenetic. They are not things that are, you know, that they're not genetic reasons why we have the health inequalities. They're structural, they're racist, you know, there's discrimination. I was on Sky yesterday, on Sky News, and I said exactly, you know, calling it exactly what it is. And it's about how we, you know, move forward in light of what we already know and what we experience. You know, how do we change that narrative? How do we address those disparities? So COVID, you know, COVID is just another thing. It's just another health inequality that we're going to experience. And it's about us as a community taking responsibility and looking about how we can, you know, self-help, self-manage, and move forward to make the difference for ourselves. So there's a lot going on. It's, you know, what's going on, it's hard work. Communities are underfunded, they're stretched, there's all kinds of things going on. But, you know, I think collectively together, you know, and not just in Greater Manchester, but nationally as well, we need to make sure that our voices are heard right across all of the different systems. So, you know, in a few words, you know, in a bit of time, that's, you know, just what I wanted to contribute in terms of what we're seeing across Greater Manchester at the moment and what we're doing in response to that.
Faye, thank you very much for that contribution. I think it sets a fantastic example of how Manchester's leading, in some senses, the national debate in relation to engagement with the authorities, and also having that transparency and accountability for our community. I can tell you, you know, you are providing great ethical leadership. It's a kind of aspiration that we want more of across the country, both to engage, yes, with government and have these discussions, but feed back to your communities, take those communities with you. And there's far too much conversations that take place behind closed doors for which the community are largely unsighted. So I can only commend what you're doing in Manchester. I'm proud to say it's my hometown, and that makes it even doubly so. And we will want to, I think, ask you again to provide further information and elucidation on what you're doing in Manchester, in the hope that others can take their lead from that. And the profound health inequalities that you mentioned, you know, I'm a great believer, and Viv will have heard me say this before in this crisis, that public health is the new politics. That's not just for Manchester or for Great Britain, it's for the world. Because you can't isolate this virus into one nation. You can't hermetically seal your borders and think that you're protected in the West. You've got to tackle poverty in India, poverty in Brazil and Latin America, poverty and ill health in Africa. Because if you don't, you'll suppress the virus in this country for a little while, and it'll come raging back as soon as international borders are open. And so I think both locally and globally, this virus has come to reveal, but also to teach precisely what's happening. In terms of accountability and transparency, Faye, I know Andy Burnham is doing some great work down there, bringing NHS and social care budgets before. I was always impressed with him in relation to his Hillsborough activities. I think that changed him from a politician to a man, quite frankly. And I think Manchester's been blessed, I think, with his leadership. How are you going about, though, the tough business of driving those inequalities? I wonder if you could say more about that.
So, okay, so we came to, you know, as I say, three years ago, devolution started. It came to, you know, 2016, and we to be quite honest with you, I initially thought, I can't do this right now because I've got my educational lead, my this lead and whatever. And to be quite honest, I sat and I thought, you can't leave it, you can't wait. You've got a real opportunity here to hold some of these leaders, such as Andy Burnham. You know, he wasn't in leadership then, but we can hold these people to account for these health inequalities. And it's been a really hard slog in terms of building those relationships. But the key for us has been building the relationships. So across Greater Manchester, we have the ears of many of our leaders, whether, you know, we've got partnerships, for example, with Manchester Foundation Trust. So we have conversations at the highest level within the hospitals. As I've just mentioned, we have, you know, conversations where people want to reset that dial with Khan, looking at that Black community, taking that community with us. We have the CCGs, but I think at the top, we have Andy Burnham's ears in terms of, you know, looking at the Black community, seeing the disadvantage and saying, how do we work together to actually do something about it? So, you know, they are slow because across Manchester, we're one of the, you know, the fourth most disadvantaged region in England. So there are lots of different priorities. You know, people come forward about housing. You know, his big agenda on homelessness. You know, we have the LGBT, you know, with disadvantage. We've got the asylum seekers, where we've got many, many asylum seekers and migrants moving into Manchester because they can't afford to be in London. You know, we've got lots of different priorities. But in terms of the Black agenda, you know, we've got Andy Burnham coming next week to our community collective meeting. And he couldn't make it because he had a Prime Minister's meeting the last time. But he sent somebody in his place and he's making sure he's coming today. So we're seeing real commitment from some of the leaders to the Black health inequalities. They have been slow, very, very slow. And in terms of resources, we do have an issue, and that's where we really need to, you know, to work. It's all very good having the conversations, you know, being on the camera, smiling, you know, with a few Black people around you. But at the end of the day, you know, we need to see some real investment in our community, and that's the work that we're trying to do at the moment with our leaders. You know, how do you, you know, not just pay lip service to this, how do you action some of these health inequalities that we see? So it is a real, you know, it's a long journey with, you know, and it's like people say, you know, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. We've got a long way to go, but we are, as I say, we do have the, you know, the ears of our leaders across GM. And, you know, we just want to continue to build those relationships.
Thank you very much, Faye. Great insight into the work that's going on in Manchester. I think that it's important that we give people information that they can use. So if we could have the contact details for you, Faye, and we can put them on screen. If you put them in the chat box, that would be fantastic. People can visit your website, find out more information would be good. Black Sox has also offered those organizations who are seeking to respond to the COVID crisis that you can email us at info@blacksox.com so that we can begin to talk to you about how you might respond to any opportunities for additional resources on the ground. And I'll come to you, Viv, to elucidate on that more. And the issue of transparency, because I want to get into the detail of telling people what the government is actually doing. Where is this money coming? Where is it likely to go? Who do we need to speak to get accountability? So, Viv, just on the practical point, and then maybe follow up with that broader point, practical advice for our community. I'm not hearing you. Are you on mute? No, could you start that again, Viv? Because your voice is cutting in and out.
Okay. I just wanted to praise Faye for the great work that she's doing with the network in Greater Manchester. That's the first point, and it's really important. And Black Sox has been connected with that network since its inception, and we'll continue to work with them and work collaboratively with them as we challenge this most recent and current issue, as well as all the other ones that were already there. It reinforces the point I was making before about the importance of us working in genuine ethical partnership on an ongoing basis, so that when these challenges are presented to us as a community, we're able to respond in an effective way, and actually we're able to address it in a way that's going to be of genuine benefit to our communities, because we've been preparing for it, so we've been proactive about it. Healthy communities actually work in a joined up way and work with other healthy communities. It's such an important point, because the inclination is, especially in communities that have been oppressed for centuries in our case, the inclination is to become more individual, more isolated, more inward looking, and in doing so become more dysfunctional and fractious. And we've got to resist that inclination and that urge, and we've got to isolate individuals that push us down that path. You know, we've got to be unifying, and we've got to be talking in a unifying way in public and in private as a community going forwards. So that's the main point I wanted to make. And again, as I said, the Caribbean and African Health Network, Greater Manchester, is doing amazing work, and it's also set there as an example of the kind of quality work that we want to see taking place through mobilization in our communities elsewhere. Practical point coming back, because I really came on this show this morning because I wanted to talk about the individual and family realities that are taking place. The families up and down the country in our community that are breaking down. There are already hairline cracks, and sometimes in some instances crevices that the families were working with. It's because of the structural inequality and racism that was discussed before that then drives this grinding economic challenge that families have to address every day. And now with this COVID-19, it's pushed the little family unit over the edge, and these families are breaking down and abuse is breaking out. If you're in that situation, now please contact one of the Black Sox organizations that specializes in this kind of work, particularly the men. I want to talk to them at the moment because disproportionately, unfortunately, whether you want to hear it or not, it's the men that are perpetrating these acts, and it's also the men that are in a position to mitigate the risk of those kinds of things playing out in the home, impacting our children, and as a result, you know, traumatizing them and setting them up on the back of this early childhood trauma for a life of dysfunction down the line. info@fathertofather.co.uk. Father to Father is an amazing organization. It's networked up with women's organizations and other men's organizations across the country to provide the kind of support that's required. It's also got specific services like Boy Genius that works with our young boys who are experiencing challenges within the education system because of the kind of early childhood trauma they may have experienced at home or elsewhere in the community. As well as the work it's doing with teachers who maybe are not as capable when it comes to working with our young people and our families, and also black frontline teachers who need that additional support. So Father to Father is the name of the organization, and you can contact them on info@fathertofather.co.uk. I know that MediaNet will put that information out, as will Lee and others going forwards. The other point I wanted to touch on very quickly, Lee, if I'm allowed to, is carers. There are so many carers in our community actually looking after vulnerable elders, and they were already under pressure. Now with COVID-19, they're under additional pressure to make sure that the elders in our community that hold our knowledge and our history are kept safe. They're also caring after vulnerable young people, got all kinds of challenges, and maybe also partners who are suffering from existing medical issues of some kind. They aren't getting the relevant information. They're not getting any very specific support. And there's one particular organisation that I want to refer to called Carers for Carers, and you can contact them on Paula 4, as in the numerical 4, and then carers. So 4 carers is one all joined up. Paula 4 carers at gmail.com, and again, make sure that information is there for people to access. We've also got to think about this in a global context in terms of capacity building. And one of the organisations that Black Sox works in partnership with very closely in East Africa is the Kafiro Foundation. The Kafiro Foundation does a whole range of things specifically to do with young people and economic empowerment, business development and enterprise development in East Africa. We're working very closely with them in development because we're interested in our young Black men and women globally, and sharing those resources and getting our young people thinking beyond their postcode at the opportunities, towards the opportunities that are available to them across the world. So the Kafiro Foundation, just in terms of some of the work it's doing around enterprise and business development internationally, particularly in Africa, but also in partnership with us in the UK, is a real key one, because economically things have just gone off the cliff. They're going to get very bad in phase 2 in terms of unemployment and a lack of access to the means to make money. And a lot of our young people are entrepreneurial, and they will find whatever means they can to make sure that there's food on the table. We want to give them as many dynamic, healthy opportunities to generate income as possible if the jobs aren't there for them. So that means training, and that means access to the right coaching and information necessary for them to establish their own businesses, as well as the initial finance that's available. There's a pot of money is going to be launched at the end of the month, aimed specifically at Black communities who are interested in, individuals in Black communities who are interested in setting up their own businesses on the back of this COVID-19 crisis. And we want to make sure that information gets out to the right individuals and organizations as early on as possible. So again, if you're in our database, you will get that information before everybody else in some instances, but you'll definitely get it at the same time everybody else does. I'll stop there. There's a couple of other points I want to raise afterwards about Black Men for Change and to revisit the Omar stuff. But those two organizations, Father to Father and Carers for Carers, are two very important Black-led initiatives doing great work nationally in terms of strategic development and services on the ground that I really want people to be alive to and be able to make contact with. I have really just come on here not to talk about the strategic stuff, though it's really important. I think David and others have done a great job around that. I want people to get the quality information that they can act on. That's what's missing right now, as Pretty and Lee and others have already stated. We're not getting access to the information in a timely fashion and services that are driven by people that genuinely have our own best interests at heart. Thank you. Can't hear you, Lee.
Just mentioning Code 7 from Lambeth, doing some great online radio shows focused on family therapy with All Girls Rock and All Boys Rock, in addition to the work of Father to Father and others. The information for Code 7 you can see on screen will come along shortly. And again, they're doing very well in providing some therapeutic impact. Pretty, I know that you work for a national charity that works in this field, and everybody's ruthlessly promoting their organizations and contacts. Tell us a little bit more about what services you provide, who they are, and how we can get in contact with them.
Okay, so I work for Minds in Haringey. So we are the front door to mental health support in Haringey. So anybody experiencing any issues, not knowing which way to go, I personally run the Wellbeing Network in Haringey. So everybody's more than welcome to ring us up and we can navigate people to the right services. We offer wellbeing activities. We offer advocacy support. We also have counselling services as well available with a mixed array of counsellors. If people do live in Haringey and do want to get in touch, they can contact 0208 340 2474. And we also, sorry, before I forget, also have a partnership. So we work with Bridge Renewal Trust, which is our voluntary sector organisation in Haringey, and we also work with Tempo Time Credits. And what our voluntary sector agency does for us is work with faith groups and various community members to make sure we can try and allocate funding, try and grow their wellbeing resources within the borough as well, and try to make sure they've got provision and support that they need around mental health within the community base.
Great. Thank you very much. There is the growing phenomena of domestic violence in our communities, in all communities, as a result of COVID. And I think we want to speak to Black men in the audience to say that we need to check on our sisters, our nieces, our families. We need to take some ethical responsibility in terms of making sure that as Black men, we provide some wraparound care. You know, you can ring up your family members to find out if all's good. The pressure cooker situations of women in fragile partnerships being locked down can see a violent toll being taken on families. And of course, you know, there are the unfortunate issues of children themselves who in some instances are violent towards their own parents. And here I'm speaking about single Black mothers. And I know that Faye in Manchester was doing some work around single Black mothers, a support group. And I think that's vitally important. One, for Black men to take a very proactive stance in responding to this. And two, to support the work of organizations like CAN and single and Black women's groups who are at the forefront of dealing with these issues. Faye, how's it going with that group run by psychotherapists, I think it is, in Manchester? Do tell us more.
Yeah, so we started the session, the group, in November last year. So it wasn't just set up for COVID. Because again, we see this ideal of this strong Black woman, you know, she can withstand anything, you know, she doesn't have mental health problems and all these kind of things. So what we wanted to do was to give an opportunity to our single Black women to come together just to have conversations in a safe space, and as you say, supported by a psychotherapist. It's going incredibly well. The women, it's not a huge group because we still have some stigma around, you know, Black women coming forward and almost like declaring themselves as needy. But the group has connected incredibly well, and finding the time where they can come together and just have open and honest conversations about what's actually going on for them, and to actually look for you know, support and advice, guidance, to be empowered. You know, the women are really benefiting from this service. So what we're actually seeing now is through COVID, a lot more women are wanting to join because, you know, as you say, you know, we've got particularly, you know, a lot of women, Black women that are single. And through this crisis, they are feeling particularly isolated, especially with their children being off school, you know, and some of the kind of pulls that they're getting from all the different directions to look after their own mental well-being, but also the mental well-being of their children. And you're absolutely right, you know, in terms of how fathers can come forward and support some of these women, like just a phone call, you know, just check in and see how these women are doing. But together, they are becoming a lot stronger. They look forward to their sessions on a Thursday. And yeah, when you speak to them now, so you spoke to them in November and, you know, it was quite subdued, and, you know, you speak to them now and they feel really the building confidence, and, you know, they are, you know, that they've got, you know, the ability to articulate themselves in a way, you know, hey, yes, I'm Black, I'm single, I've got struggles, but hey ho, I know what I can do about it. I know, and I'm working with people. So we're seeing some real positivity coming out of that. So yeah, so we're just encouraging people to join it, you know, to get some of that energy that we're seeing now from these Black women, you know, kind of spilling over into others. So yes, it's going well.
And of course, you can get help for domestic violence hotlines. I think somebody's kindly posted the Bright Sky app connective information in the chat, so you can download it to your phone and make sure you get the information right. It's the Heist Bright Sky app if you're a victim of domestic violence. And Avril Silo, I got that right, has posted that helpful information in the chat room, which is why we love doing this sort of thing, because here we are getting much more information, much more richness and diversity of information into the program out there for those who may be victims. And the point's been rightly made. Men are victims of domestic violence too. So it's not solely a women's issue, although they make up predominantly by far the greater number of victims. And, you know, what we're looking at is also the issue of bereavement in our community, because that is so deeply traumatic. And David, as president of the BAC.
Sorry, I didn't hear you, Lee. I don't know whether anybody can hear me. Can someone tell me they can hear me?
I can hear you, David. Yes.
You can hear me. Okay, great. Okay.
David, I can hear you.
All right. Okay. I didn't hear the question.
So, I didn't hear the end, but I suspect he was going to ask you to talk a bit about the adverse emotional fallout as a consequence of the bereavement, right. Disproportionately, greater level of the bereavement that our community is experiencing collectively, but also individually.
Perfectly summed up.
Yeah. A really important point now, and I can see that Khan actually provide a specific bereavement service as well. I think you're launching that this week, Faye. You might want to speak about that. But it's really important. The bereavement piece is so important. We know that after Grenfell, where there were so many Black and minority families grieving, that the service that they received, as well intentioned as it was not catering for our cultural needs in terms of grief, grieving and bereavement. So it's a really important piece. The Black churches play a really key role here as well. And again, I mean, this was a coming together of national Black church leaders who were talking about how they could provide a national service and identify local points both within the churches and outside of that also. For this particular piece, but grief and bereavement is going to be it links into what I said right at the very beginning around the issue of trauma, and so it's not just about groups and particular services within community organisations or from big organisations. It's also about how do we deal with the trauma going forward. So it's going to be a really big piece. So I think again, just like the practical conversation we're just having about listing some of these bereavement services that there are up and down the country, identifying them. I think we need to, if it's practical, Lee, see how we can pull together some of these particular resources that exist up and down the country and send that information out. And what CORE will do is to try and assist within that particular process. But I think this bereavement and grieving element is probably the most key thing going forward.
Thanks for that, David.
Sorry.
I think you're right in relation to the trauma felt here abroad. But one of our contributors online makes a pertinent point that not only are we coping with loss of life here, but loss of income, loss of jobs, and when we suffer losses from our family abroad, losses of their income abroad, communities here are placed under double pressure as a consequence of trying to support themselves, deal with their trauma here, whilst also looking to provide services and resources and support and what they can for their families abroad. Did I hear you wanted to come in there, Mr. Amoon?
Yeah, just very briefly, we're happy to, Black Sox is happy to work with CORE to pull that list together. It's something we're already working on anyway. So again, it makes sense to share those resources. I think you made a point earlier, Leah. I know you were being your usually witty self, but I'm deliberately not making reference to national white-led organizations because my main focus, especially on programs like this, is to talk from a do for self perspective. So I'm not promoting my organ. I haven't actually promoted any of my organizations yet. And I do say yet. I'm promoting organizations that actually are Black-led organizations that we fully endorse as Black Sox. Black Sox doesn't deliver services itself. That are doing great work in our community and are very, important and, critical specialisms that are required right now. So that's why I'm pushing those particular organizations. Now, having said that, there is one mainstream organization I would make reference to, which is the Women's Resource Centre, which is the biggest network of women's organizations in the UK. It does amazing work, and it's a one-stop for any of the women-specific stuff that's required. And just coming back to the men get abused as well. Well, this is why we talked about Father to Father as an organization specifically, so that the men who are victims and perpetrators and both can get the support that they need. There aren't enough organizations like that's run by Courtney Brown and his colleagues. Not enough key organizations like that, quality service providing organizations like that in our community. And that's why I've highlighted it particularly. I'm not going to talk about education because I suspect that's going to come up in another show, but it will be important as we begin to prepare for phase 2. And I'm not going to get into the business and employment element of it because I also believe that's something that will kick up in the next phase as we move forwards. But I do want to reiterate the point that David and others have made about the need for us to mobilize experts and specialists in our community, particularly therapists and talk healers like that. Many of them are sole traders. They work individually and they would benefit from being in a network that's Black owned, Black led, Black centric, that in addition plugs into other networks like Mind, which is a federalized body, and the BACP, which obviously is headed by our good friend, David Weaver. I think it's so important in this time that we begin to look to self and do for self first, and then connect with state operators and the state apparatus and the white savior mainstream organizations that all too often gobble up all of our resources and put some token services out there on the side, but not really actually dealing with our core needs. We have to come from a position of strength, as has already been said. I think it was David that said it. We come from a position of strength first, and then we talk about what else we require from them, not the other way around as victims. That's so important as a core message that we keep repeating. And our sister there, Faye, spoke in uncompromising terms about the need for us to look at our own needs and drive our own agenda. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that, Viv. I think it's important that we do. Have I got an echo? I think it's important that we do hold mainstream organizations to account. They work in our community. They get the vast majority of money to work in our community. So whether it's Mind or whether it's some other agency, it is important to have these conversations. But no less important is the requirement for Black communities to do for self. We can't simply just keep relying on these mainstream institutions. We have to look to our own resources, our own funding, our own collegiate working, our own trust and confidence within our communities to begin to consolidate our assets around the issue of providing services for our community. So we can't stress that enough. And of course, that is Black Sox raison d'etre. That's why we exist. We're a self-help movement that focuses on asset-based development within our own community. That's why we need your support, and that's why we want you to join us, and we do programs like this. Another question was, how do people get in contact with Black Sox if they've not got a laptop or they're not online? Well, very few are not online. You can always ring me. My number you can get off my Facebook page, and you can ring any number of other Black Sox individuals. Most of whom numbers are public. So if you need to get in contact with Black Sox and you don't have a phone, then if you private message me on my Facebook page, LinkedIn, or any of the other four social platforms, media platforms, I'll get back to you and we'll be able to have a discussion around that. I think that the issue of business is important, and the impact upon this coronavirus on our businesses is going to be a reckoning to think about, and we're going to want to know from government how much of that business support money is going to black businesses and how well we're accessing that. Because if we were only a micro business before, the danger is we could be substantively negatively affected by the economic consequences of this virus. So we're going to do a special program on that. I think it deserves some decent focus, and Viv's right. We will definitely come back to that. Well, it's 20 to 12 now, and we're going to round up in a minute. So I'm going to ask my panelists, who've been absolutely fabulous, to give us some concluding thoughts before I give you mine. And maybe I would start with the person who was last in because of her technical difficulties, but nevertheless made a fantastic contribution, Faye, to give us her concluding thoughts. And then I'll come to Pretty, then David, then Viv, and then I will conclude. So back to Manchester. Concluding thoughts.
Yeah, concluding thoughts are great to be on the show. So thank you very much for inviting me. We often out in Greater Manchester get forgotten, when this thing about being London centric. So I'm really pleased to be on the platform. So thank you again. In terms of concluding thoughts, I do see that this is a real opportunity for our Black-led organisations, communities to really come together under this tragedy, and I see quite a lot of that going on. I can see a lot of organisations kind of emerging and people trying to do things. But for me, in terms of being chair for CAN, it's got to be that genuine kind of interest to improve the lives of Black people. I think what we are particularly concerned of is that people see that this is a here and now thing. We can kind of do a little bit of something, and then when it's all over, we go away. CAN is here for the long haul, and we want to work with our partners. We want to work with Black Salts. We want to work with CORE and lots of organisations across the country to get the Black voice heard, so it really impacts change for the long term. So in terms of all that's going on, I think it's brilliant. But yeah, let's keep talking. Really important. Just as well, I've put a few things on the chat. Things around faith. Really massive. Lots of things coming out in the survey for us, and I think it'd be really good to continue these conversations. Some of the things that are particularly important to our community, to see how they are being addressed as well. So I look forward to coming back and having those conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Faye. And you're right about faith groups. And I think we need to get David Shoshone on our program and some of those ministers and have a detailed conversation about faith. Would you like that, Lee Jasper Drive Time on faith? I think we'll probably do that. Coming over to Pretty now and our concluding remarks. Thanks so much for bearing with us throughout the conversation. Your final thoughts.
I just want to say thank you, Lee, for having me on. I can see that we've got a great amount of work to do within the BME community for everybody to feel empowered and have autonomy. And I think, as Faye said, this is a great time to try and figure out some long-term strategies in improving everybody's well-being within our communities.
Thank you for that, Faye. And you're absolutely right. The need for strategic unity is very important. I can see questions about money and lotteries. Look, the lotteries have got £750 million. Go on their website. It's emergency COVID money. They've got to spend it in the next 6 months. We're concerned that that money will go to the usual suspects. And we want to make sure that from CORE and from, well, Dave can speak for CORE, not I, of course, but I think I picked up his sentiment here today that they're interested, and certainly Black Sox is interested in making sure that those people who are having conversations about this lottery money are indeed accountable, and transparency is offered to the community so we know what they're doing on our behalf. David, I'm going to come to you next, if I might. So David Weaver, your concluding thoughts.
Yeah, like the previous speakers, Lee, thanks very much. This has been a really important conversation, and it's enlightening the work that is taking place in regions. We know that things are taking place up and down the country. But Faye, you're right. This is often too London centric, and the work that Manchester has been doing, Nottingham has been doing, Bristol has been doing, and other parts of the country is just so important. So this is a national thing, and we touch on the current situation, which is an emergency, where funds, £750 million from the lottery, are there, but we know that already that money is not going to be spent where it needs to be spent and now because of the emergency situation. So we're going to have to link up nationally. We're going to have to make this thing even more practical, pragmatic, quick, easy, and focused on what needs to be done. And as well as the emergency, I think the speakers are right. It's a long-term thing. It's an opportunity for us to look at what needs to happen going forward. Because I always say this, that where we are now, we were going to get to at some point, because the trajectory was not good in terms of the way that Black communities are being treated. So we're going to have to really lock in and ensure that we're providing the leadership that is necessary and working with our communities to so do. So thanks again, Lee. I mean, the final point really is, again, just touching on this whole piece around the mental health of Black communities and the importance of therapy, the importance of looking after ourselves, looking after each and all within our communities as well, in terms of how we do it individually, but also the big organizational piece. And I'm just committed to do everything that I can, working collaboratively with all that wants to work on this agenda to get things done. So thanks very much again.
Thank you, David. Salient points there, which were great to hear. Still getting people saying, so happy it's not a London-centric program, and I agree. It's I'm from Manchester, so I know that we have to sort of enter the debate with very pointy, sharp elbows to get our voices heard, and this is a national issue and an international issue. We haven't said enough about the international matter for my liking. I can tell you we're going to have an international discussion being hosted by Black Sox in the near future. And we hope to make some announcements about a discussion amongst the international African diaspora from Brazil, from America, from the UK and wider, about how this virus has impacted globally. So stay tuned to Lee Jasper Drive Time and make sure you stay with us. I don't seem to have a Viv R for his final concluding comments. Oh yes, you can see him now, so he's back. So Viv, as we bring the you know what I'm going to say, the boat into the harbour, what are your final comments and thoughts?
He's gone.
Is he gone again? Have they got broadband in Hackney? I don't know. Is
it something that you said, Lee?
Your final thoughts, sir?
Yes, sorry for the poor connection. I think everything's already been said. The main point I want to keep making is that this isn't a time for us to allow individual populists to spout on about their own vision for world domination and polarization being the primary concern in our community. This is a time for us to work jointly together as individuals and organizations and families to face this crisis and come out of it potentially stronger than we went in. That's the opportunity that I see. I think it's critically important that every time we come online, that we are transparent. Those of us who have the privilege of having access to the information that our communities need, that we are fixated with, getting that information out in a timely fashion, and then providing the ongoing support needed for those best placed in our community to mobilize and activate those resources in the support of our communities more widely. Just a side point about the money that's available for laptops and dongles and all the rest of it. Black Sox Media Net and others will push that information out so that people can get access to the information through the internet, because it's one of the major ways going forwards for getting timely information. I want to thank you, Lee, for giving me an opportunity to say a few things this morning about the need for ethical service leadership and transparency. That's what I think, many of us in these kinds of roles and positions. And you really, really, really double our minds, redouble our efforts around going forwards. And as I think you said, there are a number of events coming down the pipeline from Black Sox and other organisations, and we can talk about those over the next few weeks. So thank you again for the opportunity to share with my colleagues on here this morning and with our wider community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viv R. Well, to my panel, a great contribution from you all. I say goodbye, adieu. Have a great weekend. Enjoy your lockdown as far as one can. Try and get some rest and sunshine, because as we've seen in this conversation, there's a hell of a lot of work to do, and we're going to be doing it together. So if you're online, give my panel a virtual round warm of applause. I thought they all made fantastic contributions, and we'll see all of them sometime again soon. Of that you can be sure. So panelists, thank you very much. And as we bring this program to an end for Lee Jasper Drive Time Home Edition, and I'll let you get off to deciding whether you're going to visit your front room or have have a holiday in your back garden, or whether or not you're going to do some DIY. I don't know about you, but I've never done so much DIY in my entire life. So the house is ready for contribution to house and garden, I'm absolutely sure. But these issues have been absolutely important. I hope we brought some clarity. I hope we brought some sensible contribution. I hope we've given you some hope and inspiration that there are people out here who are seeking to make the very best of the assets that we have in our community, as well as working in a collegiate and transparent way with others right throughout the country. And I'm reminded, and I'm rightly reminded, not to forget the work as it affects children with autism and disabled children, particularly the work of Vanessa Bob, but also Cheryl Garvey over the project, and indeed our own Patricia Lamour from Aspire Prep Consultancy, all working terrifically hard about the issues that affect our young people. And as we leave today, I'll say this to you: look, there are lots of conspiracies. If I'd had a program on 5G, I could have got 10 million people, plus David Icke himself, to be a guest. Of course, could have do that. It'd be clickbait. It'd be an internet sensation. It'd be right up there on the top of the charts. We're not interested. We're not interested in feeding the anxiety, the instability, and the vulnerability of some of our most vulnerable people in our communities. So we're going to be doing this weekly. It says, somebody says, can we have it twice a week? You're absolutely joking. I'll be exhausted. But it's nice to see that it's a valued program and you'd want to see more of it. We're going to be back next Saturday at the same time. We're going to focus on mental health because it's Mental Health Week. So we're going to bring David back. You might not know, but part of Viv R.'s many talents, he's a qualified therapist. And so those two will be back with some more guests, probably some more specialists in the field, and we'll have a good conversation about mental health more generally with you. Thank you so much for you who have stayed with us for the full 2 hours. Share this video amongst your friends. Subscribe, like, get on our page so that you can get notifications when we are launching again. We say a big thank you to MediaNet. You can't see him, but the man behind the screens who's making sure that everybody's in the right place at the right time. Theo Ambrose, CEO of MediaNet Live and one of our partners. Once again, thanks to our sponsors, Black Sox, the social movement, and indeed, Section 109. We're delighted to have your support. My name has been Lee Jasper. You've been a fabulous audience. This is Lee Jasper Drive Time.
Hi, my name's Lee Jasper. This is Brixton, London, and you're watching Lee Jasper Drive